Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming for this additional seminar. Today we are going to have a PhD proposal presentation. Our speaker is Joe Gebbels, and he's a PhD student of our school. And he's going to talk about strategies for reducing emissions and building the climate resilience of Western Australian agriculture. So please join me in welcoming Gebbels.
Thank you, Asha. Good pronunciation of my surname. I get all range of things. So thanks very much for coming, everybody. As my accent probably betrays, I'm from the UK originally. I've been in Australia since 2016, having spent an earlier block here in 2010-11. So I want to take you through my proposal today, and obviously welcome any feedback that you've got at the end. Sorry, let me just plug this up. That seems to be working okay.
Yeah, it is on.
Okay. So I just wanted to sort of start my presentation today with a bit of context. Agriculture is perhaps the industry that's most exposed in Australia to the impacts of climate change. We've obviously seen that through things like prolonged droughts, increase in extreme heat events, and many record low rainfall events. So we're very exposed to the effects of climate change. And in fact, the Southern Livestock Adaptation Program, which was conducted in 2012, forecast that without adaptation, profitability and productivity of agriculture is likely to fall by as much as 27% by 2030. And I think that's pretty, that's pretty scary over a less than a 20-year period. By the same token, agriculture is also a contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, contributed around 13% directly to greenhouse gas emissions in Australia, which is a similar figure across the globe. When we also include things like land use change and wider supply chain processes and inputs into that, it rises to 24 and then 29%. And I think particularly in terms of land use, being the major user of land, agriculture plays a role through that pathway as well. In terms of agricultural emissions in Australia, the lion's share of the emissions, around 70%, is associated with the ruminant livestock production sector. So that's principally sheep and cattle. And the main source of those emissions is through enteric fermentation and the release of methane. So enteric fermentation is a digestive process for ruminants. So this chart there, you can see in the blue, it's grazing beef cattle. In the red, feedlot cattle, yellow dairy, and then purple sheep. So of agricultural emissions, you can see that really is quite a large proportion of it. I'm sure you've all also seen the Paris Climate Change Agreement has set emissions reduction targets of 26 to 28% by 2030 to keep temperature rise below 2 degrees globally. And achieving those reductions without also achieving reductions in agriculture and land use is likely to be very challenging. But the challenge for the agricultural sector is that the emissions associated with agriculture are some of the hardest to abate. We don't have some of those ready solutions that perhaps the energy sector with the likes of solar panels and batteries has. So that's a real challenge for the sector. And at the same time, we've got a real, I think, growing public scientific policy awareness of the impact of agriculture and diet on greenhouse gas emissions. And we see something between 15 and 29% of household emissions is a result of what you put in your basket in the supermarket as a result of your dietary choices. So the government's response to this in Australia and around the world, by and large, has been to try and incentivise agriculture to reduce its emissions through a beneficiary pays incentive basis. We think about the emissions reduction fund in Australia will be a good example of that. Government tries to incentivise producers to implement something on their farm that has an emissions benefit and pays them for it. But it's certainly, from my perspective, I think that narrative is beginning to shift. The direction that we're seeing from a policy perspective is beginning to shift, and I think agriculture, and obviously in particular ruminant livestock sectors, are quite exposed to a potential shift to a polluter pays policy-based approach, so a carbon equivalence price essentially. I think that obviously presents a lot of risk, and certainly if we look over towards New Zealand, perhaps is the best example of this at the moment with their Zero Climate Amendment Act to include agriculture in that act. They've set some very very real targets for agriculture to reduce its emissions and indicated that there might be taxation implications if they fail to meet those. I suppose on a positive note, ruminant emissions in Australia are actually down about 25% since 2005. That's mostly because we've got less sheep and cattle than we did in 2005. But by the same token, those emissions are predicted to rise again by 2030 as normal or better seasons return and commodity prices are very high. So we're seeing a gradual increase in livestock numbers over that period. So what that leaves us with is an urgent need to think about how can we reduce emissions and emissions intensity, so on a kilo basis, as our production is forecast to increase. And I suppose those opportunities are most likely to be successful if they give us some other kind of advantage, whether that's a business climate resilience advantage or more of a market opportunities type advantage. So that really is the focus of my proposal that I want to take you through today. It's evaluating a series of strategies that can contribute to us reducing emissions for the ruminant livestock sectors. And then perhaps my final part of my presentation is around some more transformative approaches, perhaps take a slightly different approach to reducing agricultural emissions overall rather than specifically ruminant livestock. So what I will do, I'll take you through essentially a series of the chapters that I want to work on and the components of my research. So the first one is really to take a look at the emissions intensity of sheep meat. So for every kilo of sheep meat, how many kilos of CO2 equivalents are being produced. And I want to look at that in the context and over the timeframes of the Paris Climate Agreement. So 2005 is our baseline, looking out to 2020, 2030, and then looking at some sort of future potential scenarios as well. So the first step in that process is to work out or to evaluate what are the major drivers of variation in emissions intensity. And from a sheep production system, almost all of those drivers are what I would term animal-based parameters. So it's things that vary on farm, where most of the emissions, over 90%, are that's where they come from. So I've got a series of parameters up on the board. For those of you who aren't familiar with the sheep industry specifically, some of those might be a little bit unclear, but if we take one as an example, marking rate. So what marking rate means is if we've got 100 ewes, how many lambs in a year do they produce? So if we've got a marking rate of 100%, they're all producing 1 lamb. 150%, they're all producing an average of 1.5 lambs. So it's these parameters from a production system that make an impact on the overall emissions intensity of sheep meat. So the second step that I then need to take once I've identified each of those parameters is to work out how have they changed over time. So I look at 2005 and conduct a process of looking for robust data sources so that we can put in place a benchmark. And then we track the trajectories of each of those parameters through to 2020. So for marking rate, for example, there's good time series data that's collected in a standardized way and published every year by the likes of the ABS. For others, the data is either less robust or not collected on an annual interval. So I think there will be instances where I'll have to make some extrapolations and be clear on the limitations of that process. But nevertheless, I think for all of those parameters, there is at least some data available. The third step is then and looking at this 2030 time horizon to try and forecast what's going to happen. So there's a couple of ways that I can do that. The first is just linear extrapolation. So I can take each of the parameters, work out the change per year since 2005 and just continue that on. And obviously we'll put in place some sort of acceptability testing for that process. And then the second stage, B, up on the screen there, I'm going to identify some lower forecasts, some average forecasts, and some upper limits for the change of each of those parameters. And the way I'm going to go about that is by identifying some industry experts that are involved in the sheep industry and discuss with them what they see as being the change over the time period. So then I'll aggregate those responses and I'll have a series of scenarios, a series of potential trajectories overall that I can then evaluate in step 4 in terms of what would the impact on emissions intensity be. So to do that, I'm going to use the CSIRO decision support tool Grassroot, which is a whole farm modelling piece of software, and uses a series of representative site locations with lots of historical data on productivity, rainfall, other factors associated with those sites to simulate the effects of changes from individual parameters and collectively on emissions over time. So I've just got a bit of a schematic on the screen here with Grassroot. So we've identified our problem or our question. We want to identify how emissions have changed. And we've got farming systems and farm locations across Western Australia that we can tap into with sort of 30 years of data on those farms, and it's quite detailed information. Then what we do is we change parameters. So we change the marking rate, re-simulate the process, and it will give us a report that's pretty complicated but looks something like this, in which we can see things like the amount of methane produced at the enterprise level, and obviously then we overlay that with productivity. And so we'll run that simulation many times on a couple of locations so that we can see the impact of those individual parameters and then collectively. What I hope will be the key outcomes of this paper is, firstly, it'll give us a robust evaluation of the on-farm factors that contribute to varying emission levels. It'll enable us to have a look at the changes in emissions from 2005 to 2020 with some future forecasts. And although the results will be very much relevant to the local region, I think the framework that we develop could be applied in other regions or other countries. So I think I hope that will be a good outcome. And I think it's got quite broad relevance in terms of the producers themselves, research organisations, and some of the policy-orientated organisations as well, when we're thinking about what are the future pathways for us to research and reduce emissions. So just pausing very slightly, by way of an introduction to my second chapter, we talked earlier about a lot of the emissions are actually associated with cattle, be that beef or dairy-focused systems. And it's probably also true that globally it's cattle that have been in the limelight in terms of agricultural emissions, rather perhaps than sheep. My second chapter is focused on a strategy for reducing the emissions intensity of beef, and I'll just walk you through the aim of this chapter, which is to evaluate the impact of twinning, so having 2 calves instead of 1, on emissions in cattle. So just by way of starting on that, the emissions intensity of beef is somewhere between 15 and 30 kilos of CO2 equivalents per kilo of beef. You compare that to chicken or pork, which is somewhere in the range of 2 to 5 kilos. It's quite significantly higher. And one of the key reasons for that high emissions intensity is that cattle have a low biological efficiency. So what do we mean by biological efficiency? Well, their reproduction rate on an annual basis is quite low. So a lot of the resources associated with managing a cattle herd actually go into the maintenance and looking after of the mother, the dam, and then obviously her emissions have to be split across her offspring. So theoretically, by improving the reproductive rate, we can reduce that emissions intensity and hopefully also increase the productivity of the enterprise at the same time. So I think this is an interesting opportunity in terms of dual outcomes. In terms of twinning in cattle, it's got a pretty low prevalence. It depends slightly on the breed, but only about 1 to 4% of cows have twins naturally. And it has a low heritability, so it's not really that genetic. It's difficult to select for. But it is highly correlated with ovulation rate. So we can select for increases in twinning via selecting for increased ovulation rates in young animals. And using exactly that approach, there was a research station in Nebraska in the US that developed a breeding value for twinning over I think it was more than a 30-year period, in which they selected for twinning through ovulation rate and increased the average number of calves per cow to 1.5, so half of them thereabouts having twins. it is associated, twinning is associated with a series of management challenges. We do see slightly reduced birth weight and calf survival, as well as a series of other management problems. But some of these challenges can be overcome through management, through setting up our systems to be better able to manage these animals. But it's not going to be suited to an extensive environment, particularly where they're only seeing the animals a couple of times a year. So when we look at Western Australia, the bulk of the animals are in the pastoral rangelands, a small percentage in the wheat belt, and a slightly higher percentage, around about 35%, in the high rainfall coastal regions. And these are the areas that will have more intensive management. So if we just quickly run through the numbers, there's about 1 million female cattle in WA, 35% or so of those are in that region, which gives us about 260,000 adult females. So that excludes heifers, so animals that are having their first calf, which are less likely to have twins. So the focus of this chapter is really to evaluate from a theoretical perspective if we could achieve a twinning rate of 1.56, so like they did in the US, in this region for these animals, what would that look like from an individual kilo of beef perspective and at the state level in terms of emissions intensity. I mentioned earlier in my slides, I wanted to talk about some more transformative or more out there options to reduce agricultural emissions. And one of these is to consider the potential role of species substitution. So harvesting a proportion of, or replacing a portion of ruminant meat with kangaroo or macropod meat. So why would we look at macropod meat? Well, it's got several attributes that I think are really impressive and really on its side. One is that kangaroos aren't a ruminant, so they actually produce very little methane in comparison to cows and sheep. Kangaroo is highly adapted to the Australian environment. They have less impact on the rangeland environment where the bulk of the numbers are, and especially on those riparian, water zones. They've got actually quite favourable carcass characteristics. They've got a high proportion of muscle within their carcass, very low fat, somewhere around 2% compared to 25% or so for sheep or beef, and a concentration of muscle in the higher value cut regions, so the legs in particular. It does have some market penetration in Australia. It's available in Coles and Woolies, so it is available, but there are still several barriers to increasing its consumption, and it's pretty niche at this stage. I think that one of those barriers is that we haven't articulated what the emissions intensity, what the environmental footprint is of kangaroo meat, and this could potentially be a key attribute of the meat. In Western Australia, the Department of Biodiversity, Conservation and Attractions conducts regular surveys on kangaroo populations and the areas of the state in which kangaroos are harvested. So that's these zones here, not in the northern pastoral regions. So they survey the number of kangaroos, they allocate a quota, a number of them or a proportion of them that can be harvested each year, and then they continue to monitor the populations to make sure that the numbers aren't being affected adversely through harvesting. The only figures really that I wanted to point out from these tables are that of that quota that's set, we're actually only harvesting around 9% of the red kangaroos and around 16% of the grey kangaroos. So we could actually be harvesting sustainably quite a lot more than we are at the moment. And just the other thing to point out is that the vast majority of those animals in both cases are males. They specifically select the males, which are larger. So in this chapter of research, what I want to do is complete a full life cycle analysis of macropod meat. So that's the red and the grey kangaroo, which are the only two species harvested in Western Australia, and evaluate the impact on greenhouse gas emissions and what it would look like if we substituted a proportion of ruminant meat for kangaroo meat. So in order to do that, one of the first steps is to decide on what the boundary conditions are of my life cycle analysis. So I'm going to conduct a cradle to gate approach, so basically up until the point that the animal leaves the farm or the area that it was harvested on. It doesn't include things like the processing in factories, etc. So these things are the things that are excluded, and within the dotted lines are the provisional parameters that I propose that we include in the evaluation. So it's emissions associated with the animal, a proportion of the emissions associated with its mother, and then the harvest process as well. And I'm going to use an open source LCA database called OpenLCA in order to do that. There's a couple of challenges with this process that centre mostly just on data availability. The reliability of growth rate data, how long it takes an animal to reach the weight at which it would be harvested, is difficult, as is accurately identifying the age that an animal will reach that weight. So I've managed to find some reasonable data, I think, on growth rates, but it's much more difficult to predict how old that animal will be. So we can probably identify the minimum age that an animal would be to be at that weight, and then put some uncertainty in there around potential age effects. I need to determine and come up with a way of accurately accounting for emissions associated with the harvest process, and there'll obviously be distance considerations in there, assumptions around the type of vehicle that the harvester's using, etc. And then attribution of maternal emissions and potentially offspring emissions as well. So kangaroo's probably at least 3 years old by the time it's harvested. So it's probably reared or sired young of its own in that time period, and its mother may live as long as 15 years. We've got to work out how many offspring she might have in that time and allocate a proportion of her emissions to that process. So I think from an outcome perspective, I think this will be the first time from my literature review that a life cycle assessment has been completed for macropod meat. So I think that's a first and will enable us to sort of rank it with other food products. It'll enable us to compare it with ruminant meat and other protein sources, which is probably its direct competition or substitution. And we'll get an evaluation of the emissions savings, particularly if we were to harvest that full quota and not produce that proportion of ruminant meat, what that would look like from an agricultural perspective. So I just wanted to sort of finish on pretty much my first slide, which is we're facing quite a challenging future from an agricultural production perspective in Australia. A lot of our current production systems are struggling for viability, and I think that's going to intensify as we see climate change play out over the next couple of decades. So I think we need to be prepared to look at what's our contribution to greenhouse gas emissions and how do we reduce that, and at the same time, how do we adapt? And we might need to look to options that we perhaps haven't explored in great detail before. So thanks very much for listening. Welcome any questions.
So I think the Kyoto sort of protocol you don't have to account for wildlife breeding. So kangaroos, you've probably got a freebie there.
Yep.
If you're going to use that Kyoto Protocol. In terms of the simulation model, I'd persuade you to try and make that into more of an economic model, so that you actually pick up whether the changes make any difference to what a farmer might do, or a representative farmer. Yeah.
So I should probably just mention that Grassroot software for each of the farms. Sure. So the question was around, for the first chapter and running the simulations to measure the effect on emissions intensity, can we build in an economic component to that? So if we change those parameters, what's the effect on economics? And I probably should have explained within the presentation that simulation software gives you the environmental components as well as the productivity and the economics as well. And you can change, prices for given commodities, so you can take into account those effects as well.
What it doesn't pick up is the fact that once the parameters change, then because of the farmers trying to optimise profit,
yep,
then that might actually give you a different outcome. It's sort of, what it's doing is accounting rather than optimisation. But probably need to look at some of the stuff that's been done on the MIDAS model.
Yeah. So some of those trade-offs between potentially environment and productivity. Yeah. Okay.
So for chapter 1, I've got a bunch of questions for you. Chapter 1, how does the data look for you? Have you got a full set of data from 2005 to 2020 that you can put into, that you can do the analyses, or are you going to have to find a bunch of disparate strands of data to compile to get the parameters for grass grow?
Yeah. So the question was around data sources, and do we have data for each of the parameters through to 2020 for those on the Zoom? So the answer is probably in parts. So for some parameters, there's very good consistent data. So marking rate would be a good example. Sheep death rate would be another one, where there are organisations that publish this data with a consistent survey process each year. For others, take proportion of ewe lambs that are mated. So this is sheep that are mated within their first year of life. It's more challenging. There are individual published pieces of information for individual years, and they've all used slightly different methodologies. So that makes it more challenging. It obviously also makes it more challenging for the gaps and extrapolating between them. So I think so I think we have to be really clear around what the limitations are for that. I think perhaps fortunately in some ways, those factors are likely to have less of an overall effect than things like changes in marking rate, which I'm expecting to have the biggest overall effect. And when we look at our 2030 scenarios, we can put in uncertainty ratios around those parameters as well.
So, why is there only 9 and 16% of the harvested quota, if you like, being met? What's the limitation?
It's interesting if we, sorry, repeat the question for those on the phone. So what's the limitation of hitting the quota? Why aren't we using the opportunity that seems to be there, was the question from a kangaroo harvesting perspective. So if we look back over time, the proportion that's been harvested has yo-yoed around a lot. I think that one of the things that has a major effect on that is access to export markets. And there are crucial export markets like the Russian market, for example, which have closed our access to those markets. I think there's a risk of that in places like the US as well. And I think we need to be very clear on explaining the sustainability attributes of the harvest and the welfare considerations as well, because they're often the things from an international perspective where they don't have a good understanding of kangaroos and how they live that are a barrier. I think from a domestic perspective, and I would have to check this, but I think that the consumption is probably pretty flat. But I think there is an opportunity as we more clearly articulate what the benefits are of macropod meat to potentially increase that market. And there is a representative body nationally to do that.
Ross Kingwell here, just a couple of questions. One is, are you going to include the innovation of anti-methanogenic shrubs and similarly pelletized feed with that property? And secondly, are you also going to include breeding innovation where you deliver emission efficiency per kilogram of marketable product? And I guess the third one would be, are you also going to investigate demand pull? That is, what happens if there's consumer preference for carbon neutral meat? What does that mean for the sorts of innovations that might be used by the beef and sheep industry?
Thanks, Ross. There's quite a few parts to that question, so please pull me up at the end if you feel as though I haven't addressed any of them. But the first one, if I remember correctly, was around anti-methanogenic research, and is that included? So I've deliberately drawn the boundary to not include anti-methanogenic research. Clearly, that's a key pathway in the long term for industry to look at. But I think at this stage, there's relatively little in the way of commercially applicable things that we could roll out, particularly to our extensive systems at the moment. So at the moment, that's excluded. Clearly, that's an important area of research, but I think the key opportunities from a farmer perspective at the current time are around optimizing their current system and getting more productivity and hopefully then less emissions intensity. The second part of the question, Ross, sorry, could I just ask you to repeat the second?
Sure. So the second part was looking at breeding innovation, where through genetic selection, you select animals that have emission efficiency.
Yeah.
That is, their emissions per kilogram of marketable commodity are reduced.
So from a sheep perspective at the moment, there's no Australian breeding value for sheep emissions. The New Zealanders have recently launched one where you can actually identify the emissions of a sire and then hopefully over time make genetic progress to animals that produce less methane. I think the target for that process is about 1% gain per year, so it will be pretty slow, but nevertheless an important pathway. At this stage, that isn't available in Australia, but I definitely think it's an opportunity in the longer term. I suppose the other genetic link, if we think about those parameters, is one of them is changes in growth rate over time. So growth rate of lambs has improved over that period. And the reason that they've improved is genetic selection for higher growth rates, which will have had an effect on emissions. So that's how we'll incorporate that component. And the final part, if I remember correctly, was around consumer or market preference. And definitely that's something that we're seeing already. So the opportunities really at this stage are around offsetting emissions associated with livestock production through another mechanism. And that might be, growing trees or producing renewable energy to offset emissions from non-renewable sources. And so that's definitely in the marketplace at this stage. I also think we're seeing, to an extent, in people's own personal preferences, what they buy, what they put in their supermarket trolley. I think that the flow-on effect of that will continue to magnify over time, as you see industries quite focused on trying to reduce its emissions at this stage because of that risk.
Yeah, I guess just to finish on that, one example of that, as you're probably aware, is Future Feed, which is a joint venture between Twiggy Forrest, CSIRO, GrainCorp in New South Wales and Woolworths, where they're committing to develop anti-methanogenic feeds for livestock.
Yeah, so that is excluded from the research at the moment, but I think those options, as they unfold in the future and as we get an idea of their commercial uptake and acceptance, can be built into the framework that we'll develop as part of this project.
I just improvement in efficiency and in terms of feed in your scenarios.
Yeah.
As one of what's your
So one of the big drivers of differences in emission, most of emissions or the variation in emissions is explained by variation in feed intake. It's something like 85%.
Given the comments that you're getting, clearly people think that it's going to make a huge difference.
Yeah.
So you need to show what that huge difference
Yeah.
is going to be. I think,
yeah.
Even though you already know that it's not going to be huge.
Well, what we know is that at this stage, it hasn't been widely adopted on farm and recognised as having an impact currently, which means it hasn't had an impact from 2005 to 2020. That's not to say that it won't impact future scenarios. Michael, I can't see on the screen, but if you can hear me.
So I'm just interested in, with the kangaroos, you're going to limit the analysis at the farm gate. And I thought that one of the challenges for the kangaroo harvesting was sort of maintaining its integrity afterwards in terms of refrigeration. So I'm wondering whether there's going to be quite a difference between where its CO2 impacts occur post-farm gate and whether you might be missing some of the impacts or the higher impacts that system might have compared to conventional.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. And look, I'm still working out what those final boundary conditions look like. As we've got less on-farm emissions for a kangaroo than a sheep or a cow, the proportional effect is going to be higher for the rest of the supply chain. I think I need to look as part of this process at, is there a significant difference in the emissions associated with processing kangaroo meat and getting it to consumers versus sheep or beef? And a lot of that will be around things like transport difference. So I don't have a clear answer for you at that stage, other than that it's something that's on my radar.
can you just stop sharing?
Oh, I see over here. Hello.
We share again.
No, just go to change the view.
So, Joe, have you used OpenLCA or a different LCA before?
I haven't.
Okay.
I'm getting my head around that rather slowly. There are quite a number of different LCA software tools available. It seems to be, I mean, firstly, it's free, so that's obviously an advantage, but it also seems to be pretty well regarded and relatively comprehensive. I think I will have to work out a way of importing some of those data points that are specific to kangaroos around growth rates, etc., as I discussed before, and I still need to work out exactly how I do that. Yeah.
Is it something that any of your supervisors have worked with before?
Yes, one of them, but that one is currently on sick leave.
Oh, okay. All right. You and I'd like to chat with you after
Sure.
after this.
I welcome the support.
I think there was a paper on kangaroo harvesting and modelling from Greg Hertzler around about 1995 that you might want to track down.
Around
1995.
Yeah.
It's in a quite an obscure journal. I think it's natural resource modelling. You might need to track down a paper copy of it, but that was a really good paper.
Yeah.
The only one, to my knowledge, that
there was
worked out the sustainable yield
of kangaroos. So because it's been historically quite an emotive issue in terms of concerns around conservation impact, the data around kangaroo populations and harvest rates is excellent, but there's less on the environmental impact of the supply chain, essentially.
It's about the same as a sheep. There we are.
I'll let you
just
know.
over a longer distance.
Yeah. Any other questions? Michael, did you have another question?
No, I just forgotten to switch my camera off. Would you rather I do?
No, well, let's thank Joe for the excellent presentation.
Thank you, everybody.